But first of all, just a small preliminary, if you'll indulge me. I well remember the elections of 1969. It was a beautiful sunny day in Adelaide. And I remember it clearly because I spent about 3.5 hours giving out how to vote cards for Ralph Jacoby, who was standing for the new seat of Hawker. He was an industrial advocate. He'd been pre-selected by the party. And of course I was giving out the how to vote cards because I was a member of the Labor Party. And why was I a member of the Labor Party? Well, a number of reasons. If you came from my bit of Adelaide in those days, you certainly didn't join the Liberal Party. But it was principally because, I think, of Gough Whitlam. I think I differ a bit in Adam's assessment. I think a lot of people of my period, my time, my experience, thought he was something that was we desperately needed to have, that he was going to drag the country into the current century, and he was going to introduce the kinds of reforms that we desperately needed. And I well remember, actually I don't remember it quite as clearly as I should have done because some psychotropic substances may have been involved, but I remember going to a talk he gave in the University of Adelaide. It was at the time when he was still fighting for the reform of the Labor Party, and it was a big public meeting, and there was a debate about where the Labor Party should be going. I remember him getting up and saying, we need to reform this party, not just for ourselves, not just for the Labor movement, we need to reform it for the country. The country desperately needs a credible Labor Party, and the country will be poorer if we don't do this work. And then he threw his arms out and pointed up into the gallery, and I happened to be sitting up in the gallery, and he was almost pointing at me, and he said, and we need a reformed Labor Party for the young people of this country. What future will they have? You see, and you can imagine the effect that this had. So I was giving out how to vote cards for Ralph Jacoby because of Gough Whitlam. Okay, a lot of people of my period, I think that the experience is similar. So the trouble is, of course, this is like talking about a death in the family. Nevertheless, it has to be done, so that's what I'm going to do. Okay, I take it as read that relations with Indonesia are the main story. The main story there is the East Timor question, and of course, it's hung over our relations with Indonesia ever since, and the whole Timor Gap, Timor Sea Treaty, and the trial that is currently underway of Witness K and Bernard Collaery, none of that would ever have happened had it not been for the particular path that we took in East Timor. So it's a really important issue. Now, let me just say, I really think the Hocking bio of Whitlam is a remarkable piece of work. I would have been very pleased to have written it myself. But on the subject of East Timor, I think it's very, very disappointing. I'll come back to this point a bit later on, but it says, this is in Volume 2, the first point at which East Timor is mentioned, and it's only mentioned twice in that book. The Hocking bio says, the Whitlam government's overarching policy on Portuguese Timor was simple and consistent. Self-determination, the form of which to be decided by an internationally recognised expression of the will of the people. The very notion of enforced incorporation was completely at odds with Whitlam's fundamental commitment to ending colonialism. Basically, I'm arguing it's none of the first three. It was neither overarching, simple, nor consistent. But what I do argue, I think, is ironically, it was perfectly in keeping with Whitlam's commitment to post-colonialism. I'll try and explain why I say that. Well, as I'm sure everybody knows, Whitlam's East Timor policy contained three components. First of all, the idea of incorporation of the territory in Indonesia, then the idea of an act of self-determination, and then the idea of a non-violent transition. Now, Whitlam never listed these three aspects of his policy in any kind of serial order, so their interrelationship is not clear. Now, according to the conventions of rhetoric, a statement about ends is a kind of first order statement, where a statement about means and conditions are second order statements. Maybe you can see it like that. But be that as it may, it's clear that those three conditions could be inconsistent. And this is not just a retrospective judgment. Willacy wrote a letter to Whitlam in January 1975 where he points out the way things are headed, these three conditions will not be met. And some hard policy choices are ahead of us. Now, I'm sure Willacy wrote that for the record because he had absolutely no expectation that the policy would be changed, but just to show that there were people in the government who were not happy with it. Now, in the paper, and I don't have the time to deal with it now, the role of the Department of Foreign Affairs is discussed. There were some young dissenters, but whether you look at Furlonger in Jakarta, whether you look at Renouf, the secretary, whether you look at Walcott, who came later to Jakarta, they all took a realist view, and in fact Walcott coined the phrase the Cuba of the South Seas, and his argument was solely on realist grounds. It's much better if this territory is incorporated in Indonesia, otherwise it's going to be a perpetual headache for us. But Whitlam's view, I think, was not realism. Whitlam's view was quite different. And so, in a way, it's a kind of tragic idealism that we see unfolding. Now, the context for his East Timor policy, of course, was his larger view of Australia's relations with the region and with Southeast Asia, and of course Indonesia, by far the most important actor in the region. And I pick out in the paper 4 principles, and you can see each of these principles exemplified in various ways in his pronouncements. First of all, of course, anti-colonialism, the rejection of colonialism. Secondly, a specific repudiation of any past support for colonial causes. Thirdly, taking the neighbours, their aspirations, their doctrines, their view of the world, the views of the world seriously, and finally acting so that Australia should be part of its region. Now, of course, in all of these respects, policy towards East Timor, policy towards Indonesia rather, is the litmus test, and East Timor, in those kinds of terms, can only be a peripheral concern. Well, we know what happened. It was a disaster for everybody. It was a disaster for Indonesia, for Australia-Indonesia relations, not least, of course, for the poor East Timorese. It was a comprehensive policy failure. How did Whitlam explain this failure? Well, he returned many times to the East Timor issue. At the United Nations in 1982, in fact, first off, his article, the paper at the ANU that became an article in the Australian Journal of International Affairs in 1980, then of course in Abiding Interests, and then his submission to the Parliament in 1999. Now, in each case, in each instance, he stuck like a lawyer to his brief, insisting that the determining narrative of the story was civil war. And I quote a number of instances in the paper. Now, interestingly, in the second and last reference to East Timor in the Hocking biography, almost exact same comments you find there that you would find in Whitlam's writings. She says, 3 precipitate actions dashed hopes for a peaceful negotiated transition. Portugal's abdication of its post-colonial responsibilities, Portugal's physical abandonment of the territory in August 1975, and Fretland's claims to be the only authentic and legitimate voice of Portuguese Timor, despite the competing political forces. Well, tendentious, to say the least. I mean, it's a bit like describing Russian mortality on the Eastern Front between 1941 and 1945, referring to Stalin's purge of the Russian officer corps and the uncertain loyalties of the populations of Eastern Russia, but not mentioning the German invasion. And it's to be regretted, I think, that Hocking's book does not engage at all with the very extensive scholarship on this issue, which would point out that actually most of these claims are really can't be sustained in the way that they're presented in the book. Just to take one, Fretland's claim to be the only legitimate voice in the territory. The point is everybody was doing that. And in fact, probably more important even than Fretland's claim was the claim made by the UDT. They were the ones, after all, who staged the coup of the 12th of August 1975, and they staged the coup of the 12th of August 1975. Oh, they were, of course, doing this at the behest of the Indonesians and with their support, but they were doing it under the, based on the claim that Fretland had become a communist organisation and was therefore working against the interests of the East Timorese people, and they, the UDT, were the ones who were going to rescue the East Timorese people from what would otherwise be the fate of being dominated by communists. So everybody was doing it in East Timor, nothing exceptional about that. But the even more important point is that after the fighting was over, and remember it was the UDT that launched it, and the Portuguese went off to Atauro, which is the little island off on the harbour, and Fretland took up the administration, they then begged the Portuguese to come back. Please come back, because they realised that without the Portuguese presence they would be open to the Indonesian invasion, and in fact they only declared independence much later when it became clear that nobody was going to help them, and so they simply had to help themselves, and this would be the best way to mobilise their population. So, well, all the scholarship on East Timor is very clear on all those and other events, but it's really unfortunate that this really important, vital foreign policy issue is not adequately discussed in that otherwise, like I say, very competent biography. Well, now, we've got to explain this. I've got about 2 minutes to do it. I'll be brief. Lots of politicians get out of their depth when they go into the choppy, uncertain waters of foreign policy. I make no mention of Mr. Morrison, although I could, but just consider John Howard in Shanghai in 1996. There he is, just become Prime Minister, just gone to China, visits Shanghai on his first day. They doorstop him. What do you think of Shanghai, Mr. Howard? And he was completely lost for words. Oh, it's a big city. There's lots of construction. Well, I asked the person who was looking after him in Shanghai, what's the story? Was he drunk? Was he jet-lagged? No, this was the first time he'd ever been to Shanghai. He had absolutely no idea what was going on in China. Now, to his credit, he was a quick learner, very good at tactics, if not at strategy, and I think he carried off the China relationship reasonably well. We'll see if Mr. Morrison is able to learn similarly, although I think he won't have the time. But there's lots of instances for this. But the thing about Whitlam, you see, is he had no such excuse. John Howard was conveyancing in the Sydney suburbs and suddenly got thrown into the foreign policy area. Look, from the very time that he entered Parliament, he was constantly putting questions on notice to the government about foreign policy issues. He was the one who winkled out of the Menzies government the fact that officials from the People's Republic of China were visiting Australia to sell wheat and was able to embarrass them because, of course, the government didn't want this to be known. So his interest in foreign policy was enormously comprehensive and very well informed. But also, I think he had the intellectual equipment to see the bigger historical picture, and there's a section of the paper about this. Basically speaking, he's a Latin scholar and he's a classics nut, and the overarching, and I think Hocking's term here is right, the overarching theme of Roman history, which was his big subject, is the emergence and evolution of an imperial praetorian regime. And of course, when you're dealing with the Indonesians, when you're dealing with Suharto, that's what you're dealing with, an imperial praetorian regime. And it was obvious to everybody. And in fact, Foreign Affairs were one of the first groups of people to know about it. They actually brought Harry Jan from the CSIS in Jakarta, the army think tank, to Canberra in August 1974, and he actually briefed Foreign Affairs. Oh, well, we've got this plan to take over East Timor, and subversion if necessary, more positive action if it doesn't work. We were well aware that that was their plan, and we were well aware that the people who were hatching this plan were the very same people who had organised the annexation of West Papua. And remember there, OPSIS and their people, they actually managed to gather 1,025 representatives of the West Papua people in a room and got all 1,025 to vote in favour of annexation. Now, in North Korea, that's 100%. In North Korea, they usually claim election results of 99.8 and 99.9%, but they don't ever claim 100%. I've actually witnessed a North Korean election, and I can see why they might get those results. But OPSIS in West Papua was getting 100%. Well, come on. Are these people least likely to have any scruple whatsoever about the means that they employ if they've decided upon an end? And it's most unfortunate, I think, that Whitlam took them at their word. And so, although the idea of the incorporation of the territory was consistent with his own particular view of the importance to draw a line and have Australia positively repudiate its past connection with colonialism, in fact, it simply acted as an encouragement. It acted as an encouragement to these people. I think I've gone on for long enough, Leanne. There's a whole lot of other points in the paper. I'm delighted if you want to ask some questions. But I just got one final remark to make, and that is, in 1981, Whitlam, of course, published a book, A Pacific Community. These were the lectures that he gave in Harvard. And I think there it's one of the very early and consistent statements of the idea of APEC. It's not in great odour right now, but such important economic work done for so long, and he was one of the very first people to see the importance of such an institution. But what's really interesting about that book, it's all about Australia's relationship with the neighbourhood. Indonesia is only mentioned in the briefest terms and only a couple of times. This was the country whose relationship was more important to us, or as important to us, as any other country on the globe as far as Whitlam was concerned, and it was a measure of the failure of the East Timor policy that he couldn't say anything more positive about it in that otherwise very important book. So immensely damaging, I think, for our relations, immensely damaging for his reputation. But like I say, I'm sorry to have to say it, because in so many other respects, like I say, from the perspective of people of my age and experience, here was somebody who definitely made this country turn the corner, and whose achievements people have talked about already, and I think are really quite remarkable. And in fact, I can't think of probably any other Prime Minister except Alfred Deakin who's in the same class, in my own personal estimation. Thank you, Leanne.
Thank you so much, James.